Direct from historic downtown Orange, California, it's time for the Bob Gurr Show. From undersea adventures to highways in the sky, he's done it all. And now, here's your host, the man, the myth, the Disney legend, Bob Gurr.
Hey kids, I have the most interesting guest, and we're going to talk right up front about one of the most interesting projects I know you're going to love once you are able to buy the book sometime in the next year. Tom Morris, dear friend of mine, Imagineer, been around Disney a long, long time, and he's on the most interesting project, which he's been bugging me about. When you want to do history, you have to be so thorough, digging down into the exact facts and then verifying that with a number of people to verify either something was written or photographs or a movie or something. And this is what Tom Morris does. This is going to be a book, eventually, the history of Imagineering during the Disneyland period. Everybody wants to know, where did we do this work? Who were the people doing all this stuff? Well, by golly, hold your breath. We're going to have that booked out eventually. And Tom has been working on it, it seemed like 4 or 5 years. And here's how thorough he is. Every once in a while, he'll send me some photographs or some writing or map of a building and who sat where in incredible detail. We go back and forth, round and round and round on this thing. So without any further monkeying around here, I'd love to have you tell me how this project started out. And I only saw the part where I'm verifying stuff from you. So
right.
Tell me all about it.
Okay, well, it started out as another project, okay? I was interested in the kind of the archaeology of Disneyland. And I had been in the back of my head kind of thinking about, and when I say that, I mean like going back 20 years, while I was working at Imagineering. Every now and then I'd come across some interesting thing that has never been seen or known. And so I'd file it away and thinking that someday I might do some kind of a National Geographic style Archaeology of Disneyland book covering the first, 20 years or so of how it progressed physically. And I finally started that project and got permission from various archives and collections to do research there. And as I was going about researching that, I kept stumbling upon little pieces of information, but especially names of people I had never heard of before. And I thought it was particularly interesting when I did kind of informally interview Glenn Derflinger one time, shortly before his passing. It was at a lunch, at a big lunch gathering, but I sat at the table with Glenn and I just started asking him some questions that I had always wondered about. Who, for example, really designed New Orleans Square at Disneyland? I know that Bill Martin was the kind of overall art director for it, but he was busy with so many different projects. He was the architect on record, if you will, but as I understood it, he didn't really design all of those ornate, beautiful buildings. So I asked Glenn about that, and he brought up a name that I had never heard before, named Ted Rich. And I went kind of like, what? Who? And, I was kind of a little bit, not suspicious, but I'm always skeptical. So I probed a little bit more, and Glenn said, that was the project that Glenn started on. He was hired in to work on New Orleans Square, so he knows. And the person that he would work directly with was Ted Rich. Ted Rich was doing all the schematic facades, and then all the other draftsmen and architects would, basically put it down on as a construction drawing. So I thought that was interesting, a name I had never heard before. And so then I asked him, well, so I have another question. Did Bill design the castle at Walt Disney World? And he said, no, that was Ted Rich also. And I just almost fell back. I'm like, how do we not know? How has that never been known before, that Ted Rich did that. A man named Ted Rich that I've never heard of, who's never had any kind of limelight in any Disney publication, and he designed what is arguably the most photographed object in the world. Because there's two of them. There's one also in Tokyo. So I kind of kept that in the back of my head. And as I continued doing research for the Archaeology of Disneyland, I found verification from Marty, from interviews with Dick Irvine, interviews with Bill Martin. Ted Rich designed the castle based on Herbie's conceptual rough sketch. But if you were to look at the two together, you would see that they're two different and they're similar in some ways. So anyway, this goes on for a couple of years. I'm talking about this all started around 2017 or 2018 when it was going to be the Archaeology of Disneyland. So by the time 2019 rolled around, I had a list of names of people I had never heard of before, and began to connect those dots, which led to other pieces of information, memos, photos, photos of WED Enterprises when it was at the studio. Most people don't even know now that WED started at the studio, and it was there for 7 or 8 years before it moved to Glendale. So I talked with Becky Klein, the head chief archivist at the Disney Archives, and I said, you know, maybe I should switch gears here and focus in on the early days of Imagineering, because here's a bunch of names. I've got like 30 names I've never heard of before. She thought that was a good idea. Didier Guez, who is actually runs the Hyperion Historical Alliance, he's sponsoring this book. It's actually a monograph. A monograph is fancy talk for a scholarly book, academic book on a particular topic. So I switched gears in 2019, thinking that this might be about 30 or 40 Imagineers that we've never heard of before. And as I fell down the rabbit hole, it turns out between 1953 and the end of 1955, there were about 115 people who were Imagineers at one time or another. Sometimes only for a 4-month or a 6-month period of time. But if you took all the heads that worked on Disneyland, that designed it, that reported through the WED office to Dick Irvine, you get about 115 people.
Well, you know, a curious thing, this is the first time I've heard a number of that many people, because what a lot of people don't realize that how we worked on those first few years, we were never, we being the WED people, were never in one place at any one time, and we were squirreled all over that studio lot. Some were in the animation building, some were a couple of people over in near the machine shop. We had the Zorro building. We had people scattered in there.
Right.
That was along with people that were actually running the studio back a lot.
Right.
And this was a curious thing. Not until we moved in August of 1961 to 800 Sonora that we saw, oh, this is a lot of people. But the number that you gave me included all those people. Some came and went in that whole period of time. So I'm intrigued by the fact that you used the word archaeology and Disneyland all put in the same thing, in the same phrase. That really made me feel like Disneyland is really old. If you have to have an archaeologist, and then you shifted to the fact that maybe we ought to look at WED. Yeah. And I feel funny now that an archaeologist is digging up my past. Yeah. in WED Enterprise. Yeah. This is a very,
and it's all good.
Very funny setting to me.
Yeah.
So keep going, Tom. Well, I want to hear more.
Yeah. And actually, I would say maybe at the height, when the most heads were there simultaneously together was probably in early '55, when things really geared up for the park, because this might blow you away, but the construction drawings did not begin until the end of November.
Yes.
So that gave them
Of
8 months.
1954.
Of 54.
Yes.
And it really didn't get really into high gear until around February and March of 55.
Do you know what Tom just said? We opened in July of 1955. Nobody started to draw buildings until the end of November of 54. This is unheard of, that a company's going to build a project they've never built before, and they've never been in that kind of construction business. And look, they did it. This is why this book is going to be so important, to find out who did all this stuff so fast.
And how many people did it take? You know, I started to ask the question, how many people did it take to design Disneyland? And how many people did it take to produce and construct Disneyland? Not the construction itself, the construction workers, that was handled by a contractor, but what I was counting were the people that reported through the WED office, the machine shoppers who reported through the WED office, consultants like Sam Hamill and Ruth Shellhorn, the landscape architect, and then some of the production houses like Aero Development and Todd Shipyards. And so those are all separately highlighted. So if you count those in, it's more than 115. Yeah. But I'm talking about at the studio who were hired, who would be somehow reporting up to Dick Irvine, and in that office at the studio, because the bulk of them were in 1E in the north side of the first floor of the studio. Yeah.
So let me tell me, you shifted from Disneyland archaeology to WED archaeology, and now you have discovered all these names. How in the world did you start to get a handle on this, and how you might structure the inquiry and then have all this verified, heading towards eventually a publication?
Right. So the original idea, when I shifted gears into the archaeology of imagineering, basically, I thought it would be one monograph, and monograph is usually up to 160 pages. And I thought, you know, it might be tight because I wanted to take it all the way to the opening of Walt Disney World. So this is kind of interesting. It didn't take long to get all the names of all the people, to get about 90 to 95% of all the names of everyone who came through WED Enterprises from 53 to 71. It didn't take long to get that list. I'm not going to divulge how I did it, but it was relatively simple, and also what they did. So over time, a few names would still kind of trickle in here and there. Maybe they weren't in the office, you know, but maybe they were working from home, or they were consultants. But pretty early on in the project, I got the total number, and the total number was about 900 between 53 and 71 who came and went.
Wow.
So then I'm like, there's no way this is going to fit in a in a 160-page monograph. So I talked with Didier about that, and we decided we'd try to do it in 2 or 3 volumes. And what I'll do is start with that interesting question of how many people did it take and how long did it take to design Disneyland? And so that's what the first volume is about. It goes from 53, or, you know, the end of 52. Actually, it goes back a little bit to cover some of the pre-Disneyland developments. And then it kind of starts in 1952, and it ends at the end of 55. After they're finished with Disneyland, there's a big layoff, and then not long afterwards, they start bringing people back to do the 1956 jobs. So it covers all of those folks who were hired up till the end of 1955.
By the way, what a lot of people also don't realize about some of the Disneyland history, some of us who were there at the opening day and watching our first black summer, in a way, with everything breaking down, none of us foresaw that this would last very long. It was a nice idea, and it's, you know, all kinds of operational problems. But somewhere, the park started to close around the time school restarted. So we had closed Mondays and Tuesdays, so we could take a deep breath, try to repair stuff. What are we going to do next? Try to look out few more months, and by golly, by the time Thanksgiving came along in 55, Walt had all these ideas about what we could do for 56, which indicated, oh my gosh, this thing might last. And certainly by Christmas time, we found out people were coming back to Disneyland in droves in the winter time.
Yeah.
And that sort of launched the fact that, say, this is going to work. And oh, by the way, are we ever going to be really busy? And that's where a lot of people asked to come back.
Right.
Because we didn't just open a park, we're going to continue building a park.
That's right. And the second volume is really about the perfecting, if you will, this new art form.
Yeah.
So, yeah, it's fascinating. And let me go back just a little bit to the purchase of the land in Anaheim, which, wasn't finalized until April, I believe, of 54. Yeah. So they don't even start a survey until around June of 54. And so there were some drawings that were done prior to the WED construction drawings, and those were done by Wheeler and Gray, a company that continued to work with Imagineering for decades. In fact, I think they might even still be around. They did all the structural engineering for Disneyland, and also eventually WED got some of their very best engineers like John Wise and Don Edgren. Yeah. And so they did the first drawings, which were foundation, the pads for the park, and framing for Main Street. So that started, I think, like in October. Right. So it's still less than a year from the time the very first drawing was done. And they didn't actually begin digging on the land until, you hear that it was a year and a day, but a year and a day is when, I believe, a trailer moved onto the property from the McNeil Construction Company, not when they cut the first tree or when they dug the first ditch. So they cut trees like a week later, so it was less than a year. Yeah. And they didn't really start digging until, I think it was the end of August or the beginning of September. So it's going to open in, 10 months?
Yeah. I remember vividly going down to the site and thinking, they're going to open this when? And this place is a crazy place full of bulldozers, tearing stuff, moving stuff, digging forms, starting to pour some concrete. And I just shook my head and I thought, there's no way this is going to get done. But guess what? People had never seen Walt Disney build something in the same way that the zeal that he would put into animation, movies, and television.
Right. So one of the things that began to become evident as I continued my searching down through the rabbit holes was that some of the stories that we've heard are not completely accurate. There's a little bit of the Mandela effect that has been at work, and a lot of the stories that we've heard kind of derived from publicity, from Disney publicity. And I remember Marty telling me one time that it was his job working for Ed Edinger and Eddie Meck, to write these stories, but Marty was getting those stories from people that preceded him in his new job as a publicist. And so Marty wasn't there to see that. He's taking the word of some of these folks, and some of those folks were taking the word of someone else. So you get the kind of the game of telephone happening. So one of the things that, and I understand kind of why it was spun this way, was that you hear when Walt started WED Enterprises, he didn't want architects, the typical architects working on it. He wanted to draw from his own studio personnel of art directors and backlot designers and artists and animators, etc. And that turns out to be pretty untrue, because there was no art department for live action films in 1954. They had only, at that time, they had just finished 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea. Every other live action film had been shot in England before that. So there was not an art department with set designers and backlot designers. And also his deal with Roy and the shareholders and the board of directors, Walt's deal with them was that he's not to cannibalize the studio's personnel, because they have got a live action film called 20,000 Leagues that they sunk a bunch of money on. Lady and the Tramp, a CinemaScope animated film that was costing a lot of money in production. Sleeping Beauty in pre-production. The TV show that he's got to produce, a weekly show for. So initially, none of the WED Imagineers came from the studio. Folks like John Hench and Claude Coates eventually came on board at the beginning of 1955 because they had finished Leagues, 20,000 Leagues, and finished Lady and the Tramp. And so then it made sense to actually cross-utilize them because they were between films. So they discovered, oh, we can kind of leverage back and forth. And that's when they started to bring in studio personnel. The exception was Bruce Bushman. So Bruce was in on it pretty early. I mean, I'm talking 53. He started doing his drawings. But the other 110 or 115 WED personnel, mostly like 90%, 95% came from Fox, MGM, and Warner Brothers.
I understand at the time that when you see the architectural details on the Main Street, it seems that architects would design things properly, which meant each floor has the same height. But it was quite obvious that at Main Street, even the ground floor was kind of scrunched down. The next floor was down a little more. The upper part was a little bit more than that. And somebody told me that, well, you don't let an architect design something like a Main Street. You go get a theater designer, because apparently theater designers are used to making a stage in front of a live audience where you have this tip-up stage slightly, you have this kind of foreshortening, the way you do a lot of little details, so your eye can read depth a little bit different. And then obviously I could see why Disneyland, the sketches that some of the artists did, oh, it's got to be kind of cute and stuff. Well, obviously then the proportions are going to be entirely different. Oh, no wonder you have some theater people come in and guide that kind of design.
Almost most, I would say there were some exceptions. They all came from film. There may have been some from theater at the time who graduated or went over to film, but they all came from film. And the reason is Dick Irvine was connected. Dick Irvine was the chief creative person at WED. He was basically in charge of WED. And there were some others that had an administration duty or other duties, but Dick Irvine was the guy. He came from Fox. He had worked with Walt previously, and Dick knew all of the heads of art direction departments at all of the studios knew one another. They were not in competition with one another. They all knew who their personnel was, where their strengths were. If they were letting someone go who was really good at Western streets or something, they'd let the other architect or other art department heads at the other studios know. I even heard a rumor, but it's not verified, that when MGM began laying people off at the end of 1954, that they basically directed people directly to WED Enterprises. It was the outplacement basically directed them to Burbank. And that seems to be true because suddenly there's a huge onboarding of MGM folks at the end of 54.
Yeah. Interesting, Dick Irvine, oddly enough, hindsight, I didn't realize it, that apparently Walt had told Dick Irvine to call me at the little shop I was working at and said, go out to the studio and meet Mr. Irvine at the gate. And sure enough, Mr. Irvine was at what would be the time clock station on the Buena Vista gate. I didn't think about it at the time, and then within an hour or so, I saw that Mr. Irvine is in charge of everything going on here. And then in later years, I thought, wow, he never meets anybody at the gate, but somehow I met him first off right at the gate.
Yeah.
The other thing was there never seemed to be any organization between where all these animators, Imagineers of future Imagineers were scattered all over, but Dick was in the center of everything. It just seemed to be, here's an empire without a matrix list, no layers of management.
Yeah.
It's everybody talking to Dick and doing something. Just all radiating on this one guy.
I've never seen an org chart for early WED. I created one. I was able to create one from the information that I had. And it was very flat, it was Dick, basically, and everyone else. And then if Walt wanted to talk to anyone else, he would. So there was no like, well, you have to go through, this way. I mean, I don't think anyone back then, any layman or any, a draftsman or architect that they brought in would feel comfortable going directly to Walt. But the other way around, Walt would suddenly be behind them. That
was the very curious thing that kind of intrigued me. Yes, everybody comes and goes around Dick.
Right.
But Walt, I guess, it was his studio.
Yeah.
He showed up everywhere, every day, looking at everybody doing something.
Right.
And what was the interesting thing, Walt was not critical. He would curiously look at what you're doing, and if something wasn't quite right, he'd start a little conversation about, say, Bobby, did you ever think of doing it like this?
Yeah.
So in other words, it's not really micromanagement, but it does mean Walt is down in the tiniest detail that is important from a functional or a visual standpoint.
Yeah.
I thought that was, I heard of a company doing that, but that's how they were doing it.
Absolutely. Yeah. And you're right. I mean, it wasn't quite micromanaging, but it was him being aware of everything that was going on, and then the way he would work with them, making suggestions. And Marvin Davis, one of the first Imagineers who actually master planned Disneyland and Walt Disney World, tells the story about Walt coming in the morning and say, hey, did you think about doing it this way? And so he'd incrementally go around, like every day Walt would come by and suggest a different thing or whatever until they came back to the original thing that Marvin had done a week or two before that.
Yeah, this is funny. You mentioned Marv Davis. He was always kind of a quiet, methodical, well-coiffed type of a fellow, very, very sharp and neat, kind of quiet. But it seemed his desk was full of erasure dust. It was like Walt would be coming by, and luckily he's using pencil, not ink. And watching Disneyland grow, the main area of Disneyland on Marvin's desk, it kept shifting, and there's this eraser dust being brushed off of it.
Yeah, and so much of it was done on tissue, on what we called bum wad back then, tracing paper, and puzzle piecing, various pieces together, and then putting a big piece over that and redrawing. And Marv, depending on the interview, drew up between 115 and 130 something plans for Disneyland, and we've only seen 7 or 8 of those plans. Thank goodness for some of these auctions where a couple of the ones that I had never seen before have popped up. So I wonder where all of those are.
Well, maybe, if any of you are collectors out there and you feel it's appropriate, maybe you ought to call the company, get a hold of Tom here. If you've got something that is one of the missing pieces in the archaeological story of the WED Enterprises group.
Yeah, a lot of times you don't know that it's WED Enterprises. So I discovered that through photos that had been taken in the WED office, but weren't necessarily in a collection or file that would say WED Enterprises. They might be in a collection that says foreign visitors to the Walt Disney Studios. Well, why would I look into that folder? But sure enough, Walt or someone is taking some of those visitors around the studio, and there's a publicist taking pictures in the various areas. Mark Davis's office, when Mark was an animator, or somewhere out on the lot. And then there's these, you wouldn't know that's WED because you wouldn't recognize the people because it's not the 10 names that you always associate with the beginning of WED Enterprises, and it's a somewhat anonymous office. So I've discovered photos that were taken in the WED office, and those photos show some of the people. I've been able to match most of those people with the names and what they did. So getting back to who were these first Imagineers who came from the studios, and why were they so good? Why were they able to create, like Main Street is one of the most difficult things to do. We've learned that now from Walt Disney World, from Disneyland Paris, Hong Kong Disneyland, even Hong Kong Disneyland, which used Disneyland's drawings, took longer to do the construction drawings. Same with Walt Disney World, those were new buildings, but it double the time period. Well, these original draftsmen and architects, some of them were more architects than they were necessarily creative concept people. But let me tell you about architects who got their degrees around the 1930s, 1940s. When you got your architect's degree at that time, or even earlier than that, many of these people studied at the best universities in the United States or in Europe. They studied in Rome and in Paris. And you also back then, you had to take sculpture, you had to take all sorts of art history classes to know all of the kind of classical periods. That's not something that's required anymore. But back then it was. And so a lot of these architects got their degrees in the mid-20s and opened up their offices, in various places around LA or the United States. And guess what happened at the end of the 20s? There was a thing, kids, called the Great Depression. And suddenly there was no work for architects, except in Culver City and Los Angeles and Hollywood, where that industry was ramping up and they needed backlot designers, set designers, and architects. So a good number of those set designers had architectural degrees, architectural backgrounds, and they became the designers of those backlots at those various studios. And some of them at the end of the Depression went back to their business, but most of them stayed on at the studios because that was real, steady work. And so when Disneyland comes around, some of those studios are beginning to lay off. They're downsizing their art departments.
Well, this is very fascinating. I had never given a thought to the fact that what happened in the 20s and 30s, architects were trained to be much more broadly informed of history. Do you know what a blessing that must have been to be to Walt, to have an architect come in and you say, oh, here's a sketch, draw it this way. He could automatically add those little correct flourishes here and there, and you just get that for free because that's the way these people were trained. I never heard that before.
And not only that, but at WED Imagineering, you might work on one project a year or maybe 2 projects a year. These guys from the studios worked on, a dozen films a year. So over their career, they had either art directed or done sketch work or set work for over 100 films. So it just became natural for them. I mean, hacks in the best sense of the word, that they come in at 8 and take an hour and a half lunch and leave at 5, and brilliance is on their drafting board. It doesn't need any correction because they just nailed it. And so I understand from one of my interviews that with someone who's still around from that era, that some of these older guys that came in, the veterans from MGM, who had worked on Wizard of Oz and all of these great films, some of them were a little bit, not happy about having to finish their careers working on a amusement park because they didn't know what it was going to grow to be. And so a lot of these guys, a good, a couple handfuls of these guys were in that in-between period of about, age 60 to 65, and they wanted to get to 65 so they can get their pension from the art directors union and all of that. So that's why they're doing this. Otherwise they'd like, oh, well, MGM laid me off, so I'm just going to retire now. No, they were bridging their time. And so I don't know if there was resentment or not, but some of them were thinking, gosh, I'm ending my career working in the carny business. And but they were still terrific. They were these guys. I have looked at every single drawing of Main Street. I looked at them 20 years ago when I was working on Hong Kong Disneyland, and I was amazed. But recently, I've looked at them even closer, and it's amazing how quickly, because all of these are dated, and I have seen updates that have the schedules of when we're starting on the 200 block or the 300 block, all the blocks of Main Street since the beginning of time through all of the castle parks are numbered the same way, with the Emporium building being 300 and the next one is 400, etc. So they did it sequentially. And, these construction drawings were done in about a month for each block for the entire wraparound. Now, Marv Davis had already done the schematics, and there were little changes here and there that were usually prompted by what lessee might be going into a space. So sometimes there'd need to be a modification. But they did, each one of those packages was done in a month.
Well, you know what you're telling me. I'm starting to get this picture here. WED, when designing Disneyland, never took a breath. They just go like mad.
Right.
Same way opening the 1971 Walt Disney World.
Yeah.
Almost exactly the same thing, but just involving more people and a little bit of organization stored into it.
Right.
But through that whole period, we've now gone to almost the second and third generation of Imagineers. None of them would be in a position to have a big sweep of the whole thing in their mind, what they're working on, and you're the first one that's ever doing that. This is a very unique situation, that what you're telling me, all that whole sweep of 52, 3, 4, 5, you're the first person that's actually collected it where it's in your mind and it's all evidence. And you're sorting that evidence and organizing it.
And thank God Walt and the studio filmed the construction on a weekly, sometimes more, basis. You've seen the stop action stuff, some of it, but there's a lot more, and it's not all stop action. And I only know this because there's been some production companies recently that have been doing Disneyland, history, and sometimes they'll send me a little reel and they'll say, do you know when, or where this is? And I'm able to identify, if it's a close-up of the construction site, I'm 99% of the time able to identify where they are on the site, and sometimes who are in the shots and when the shot was taken. So hopefully when I finally do the Archaeology of Disneyland book, we'll have a day-by-day, maybe chronology of the site work that went on there. So it's one way, all of that photography and footage and memos and plans are great because it's got drawn by, approved by, it's got an engineer's signature on it, so you know when these people were working on what. And I had no idea when I started this that level of information would ever exist, would ever be able to be pulled together.
We had a standard WED title block on the drawings.
Right.
That was pretty much the same throughout WED.
Right.
Some of the mechanical stuff where I was a little bit different. But yes, that gave, in hindsight, a beautiful record that can be used now to reconstruct the who, what, and when. I hadn't realized how important that would be at the time because it was only long enough to get the drawing printed, get it built, and burn the drawings, sort of a thing. But now that evidence is now making sense.
Yeah.
The whole thing is starting to close up.
Yeah. Now it becomes more difficult when sometimes the draftsman would only put their initials, But even then, I was able to track it down. But sometimes they would just put one letter down and like, A. You know, who is A? So getting back to this group, talking about the draftsman, architect, set designer, there were basically 4 or 5 classifications. Art director, you had to have been an art director at one of those studios to get that title at WED, and there were only 5 that were given that. Some of them may have been art directors before when they were at a studio, but for Disneyland there were 5 art directors. Then below that, well, not necessarily below, but another classification was sketch artist. So Herb Ryman was a sketch artist. Bill Martin became an art director. He started as a sketch artist. So a lot of these folks were sketch artists, Sam Hamill. And then it was draftsperson.
Yep.
And you might be an architect, you might be a licensed architect, but that's not your title. You're either a draftsman, a sketch artist, or an art director, or I think set designer might have been another classification. So now some of these architects who were set designers were no longer licensed, or they had been in the film business so long, they've kind of lost, day-to-day touch with the latest building codes and standards. So they did bring on board 2 or 3 currently licensed architects, and they were the people that dealt with city planners and the city planning commissions and did all of the statutory work of the official licensed architect signing, approving the drawings.
That would be something a lot of people that follow Imagineering don't realize. The art director says, here's what we're going to do. We're going to do it this way and this way and this way. Oh, by the way, somebody will sketch that up. Then pretty soon you dig a little bit deeper, but at some point, further down in the line of making all these drawings, they have to be drawn slanted toward the Department of Building and Safety in Anaheim.
Right.
Because the committees in Anaheim are not artists. They can't read interpretations like, say, the architects and art directors could do. It had to be specific because now you have people checking the code details before they can do what's called a wet sign drawing to authorize you to dig a hole in the ground, pour concrete, and put a building on it and put a show in it.
Right. And Walt didn't want to shortchange that process because it all came back to him. If there was any kind of a safety issue or anything, he didn't want to be certainly liable for that. So everything was done properly, quickly, but properly, with the right kinds of people. One of these architects, and he had worked at the studios, years before that, but now he was a registered architect doing housing developments and buildings and things like that. And he quit right after he had finished doing the work that he needed to do for Main Street, because he got the contract to do Biola University, which is in Norwalk, I think, and was one, at the time, it was a very state-of-the-art kind of university, all in, like a little city, all planned together with living and, retail and dining and all of that on the campus. And so that's what he's famous for. He's not famous for having worked on Disneyland. He's famous for having designed the Biola University campus. And there's a lot of stories that are like that, where some of these draftspeople or architects or set designers, maybe they were only at WED for a year or two, but they went on to even bigger things.
So I'm starting to grasp all this now. There's such a magnitude of work that you're doing. I just saw the little edges when you sent me something that says, Bob, who was sitting in this stool in this building at what time? this kind of thing. Or trying to remember who is these people in the picture.
Yeah.
Because we had pictures of people that we had no names to connect.
Yeah.
But the fact is you could ask other people that there's not too many still alive at my age that could remember some of this stuff.
One of the overlooked photo people was Sam Hamill, who is in a famous shot with Harper Goff and Walt Disney on a Jungle Cruise boat. The boat doesn't have its canopy yet, but Walt is talking to Harper, and then there's a guy in the middle with a cap on. He looks like, Floyd the plumber or something. And he's never named in any of these photos. Well, that's Sam Hamill, and Sam Hamill is a big, big, big deal. He was basically the engineer for everything on the site in 1955 except structural. So Wheeler and Gray handled structural. Hamill did civil engineering, mechanical engineering, electrical engineering, lighting, and hydrology.
That's interesting as you mentioned Sam, because yes, you start with all of the cute art and everything you want to do, but at some point in time, somebody is, by the rules, going to start laying out land, staking stuff out, digging trenches, building concrete forms, and starting to pour the concrete. And it has got to be right, because you don't want to find something that's wrong and have to dig something up while you're trying to put a building on top of a foundation.
Right.
Trying to put electrical, trying to put plumbing and water lines and everything. Sam was the kind of guy that he could go right past the art part and see what they need to do, and that is just like cut and dried standard construction.
Right.
That's the basis upon which you can put beautiful art and themed attractions.
Right. And he had done some beautiful art in the form of civic water fountain displays. He was a specialist in water fountains, waterfalls, and lighting those. And for the 1939 New York World's Fair, he was hired by Robert Moses, to do the big fountain lighting show for that fair, which synchronized for the first time music, lighting, water, etc. And he would later do that again for the 1964 World's Fair. So by this time, he had become kind of a lighting guru, who was here's another weird thing. There's a place called Neela Park in Cleveland, Ohio. I'd never heard of it before. Neela Park. Neela Park is where light bulbs were developed after Edison, came up with his prototypes. Then they developed this lab that's in Cleveland, that's still there, where they invented Christmas lights and fluorescent lights and colored fluorescent lights and mercury vapor lights and sodium vapor lights and all of that, strobe lights, ultraviolet lights. And Hamill was a specialist in that. And so that's how Hamill got connected with Walt, was through Neela Park and General Electric, because Walt Disney Productions and all the studios relied on Neela Park for projector lamps.
Well, let me ask this question now. It seems obvious that Walt had the ability to search out and pick out people that could do things, and in a very short period of time, starting maybe only in 1952, have all these people that really knew what they were doing and had them all agree to come over and help in whatever degree. How do you think Walt was able to do that?
He had he had friends and people who he could just call up, and some of these were carnies. So here's another thing that kind of a misunderstood or mistold story, is that all the carnies said that Walt was crazy and it'll never work and blah, blah, blah. And that's not true. Maybe, I'm sure there were some carnies that thought he was out of his mind. But he was very good friends with a guy named Dave Bradley, who ran the Beverly Park in Beverly Hills on La Cienega. And he became very good friends with Bud Hurlbut. And he also got hooked up with George Whitney Jr., whose father ran Playland in San Francisco. And George Whitney Jr. was the general manager of it. And these people were on staff. Some of them were, like, there was a guy from back east from Ohio named Ed Schott, who ran a park out there. And he loved this idea that Walt was doing. And he said, I'll do it for I'll be a consultant for $1 a day or whatever. So he was a consultant. So he had these people. Even the manager of Farmers Market, the general manager of Farmers Market here in Los Angeles, gave him lots of suggestions and advice, because Farmers Market had all these different small lessees, which Main Street was going to have. How do you manage all of those mom and pop type things? What do you do if you have a problem with one of them? And the other piece of advice that this guy, I think his name was John Gostovich from Farmers Market, gave Walt an idea, which was to high pressure hose down the park every night, which is what they did at Farmers Market.
Well, you
Pressure
know,
wash. And so each of these guys had some little jewel, some little nugget
yes.
of information that was very useful to Walt. He had 3 or 4 trained people who operated little train rides around the country, around the state.
Well, the funny thing was, as I was getting used to day by day what at least I'd been dragged into, working with Roger Broggie Sr., which had a kind of a broad picture of everything, being in charge of all the mechanical development that would go into Disneyland, we began to interface with a lot of people. Most of it seemed to me came from Texas, and Roger would always warn me about, Robert, those are the carnies, and I didn't know what a carny was. And then I figured out, oh, these are traveling vagabonds. They all go across America putting on traveling shows. And Walt had obviously picked some people out that could shift gears into a fixed type of park.
Right.
And they were helping Roger figure out things we're going to do. And then Roger would have me start working with some of these Texas carnies. And it was a very interesting thing, but somehow I was now working with people out of the 30s with some sort of vagabond-like ideas of doing things, which is quite a bit different than 1955 type of thinking.
Right.
So what else can you tell me about how Walt would interface with these carnies? Because this is like plucking the minds of people who would be used to operations.
Right.
That would feed into the design in time to have the design fit how operation would actually work, which we didn't know until we opening day, and then we find out people behave entirely different than what we thought.
Well, the Texas folks were hired by C.V. Wood, and who was from Texas, and so C.V. Wood is a whole other tangent. But not all of them were necessarily trained in amusement parks or carnivals, but they were like industrial engineers or had run factories. They were all part of kind of a fraternity, if you will. It wasn't a university fraternity, but they were called the Bombers, the Texas Bombers. And it was a clique of people. C.V. Wood, I think Schumacher, Fred Schumacher, and oh gosh, there were like 6 or 7 of them. And a couple of them lasted through the first 4 or 5 years, I think. Schumacher did. But C.V. Wood didn't last long, and some of the others would leave with him.
Well, you know, I did get the distinct impression that Walt enticed these people to come and help him until, by osmosis, much of the information they had, Walt was gradually absorbing it.
Oh, yeah.
And then at some point, probably by 56, 57, they were no longer there. And I got the impression that, well, Walt had gotten all the information he needs, so he invited them to go back to what they were working on before.
I think most of them saw the writing on the wall, so they left through 1955 to 1960. Schumacher left, I think, to run the 58 World's Fair, the American Pavilion or something. He came back, Schumacher came back for the Disney's work on the New York World's Fair in 1964. So he came back around 1962. The others, I'm trying to think how long they lasted, but Whitney was there for quite a while, and I think he, had his own park to run in San Francisco, so there probably wasn't much incentive for him to stay. But they did offer good advice. I mean, George Whitney Jr. was probably the first person to ever invent ride control.
Oh, I interfaced with George quite a bit, because he was the only guy that I could talk to that actually operated a little bump cars in an actual amusement park.
Right.
And some of the ideas that his experience was, slowly were not quite working in our Autopia ride.
Right.
So there was this transition of, well, we'll try something George's way, and then it doesn't work.
Right.
And then, well, okay, now what are we going to do? So
Yeah.
we have to keep changing stuff.
That's right.
Until we get stuff to work.
Yeah, you know, Aero Development, of course, was involved with some of the rides too, and Whitney worked really closely with the guys at Aero Development because Aero Development were specialists in manufacturing ride systems, but not in control,
Yes.
in ride control. Ride control is something that was really not needed in the world of amusement parks at the time, because if you had a roller coaster, you'd operate one train or maybe two trains on the track, or even if you had a dark ride, some of these like pretzel, they called them pretzel rides, dark rides, would have only like 2 or 3 cars on the entire track. So there was never any danger of them running into one another.
Yeah. You mentioned roller coasters. When Walt asked me to design the track layout for the Matterhorn, 2 tracks inside that beautiful little pile of ice cream there, I wondered how did they do this, because roller coasters, every time I experienced them, they were open woodwork and one train car, and the ride operator would watch the train, and then when it came back to the station, he had a great big lever that he would pull to make the train stop and unload and then load the next one, let it go, and then watch it go around. Walt wants 2 tracks buried inside where nobody can see anything.
Right.
And this is where the first time I came across that word ride control, I didn't realize until Matterhorn opened how critical this was and how well that worked out. And that was Aero Development, and who else had worked on that ride control that you found out?
I don't know for sure, and there's another specialist who is trying to track down that information. Whitney may have had some tangential, but I think by 59 or 58, Whitney may have gone back to Playland. So I don't know. Some other people that are also looking for that information don't exactly know either. So there's a lot of little mysteries that are still out there.
Because
it's important though, because ride control is, you know, so key to the industry now for capacity and safety. And it was not even a thing, I don't think, before Disneyland. I mean, ride control would be a single brake on a
because
ride.
Disneyland would have like a Mr. Toad ride. It's a flat track. You send a car out and it comes back. Nowadays, you have different attractions at Disney parks where you have vehicles floating around all by themselves on no track, and they're scooting and turning and doing everything is completely different. And they don't bang into one another, and they behave themselves. This is utter magic that's going on in control that comes out through something in the floor for charging, something that RF signals where some kind of sensors know where every car is, and every car has an instruction to do something always a little bit different, and every time you rewrite it, well, that's not what it was like the last time I went on it. This is a magnitude, gigantic jump from the idea of a roller coaster that you can't see it to a Matterhorn that's you can't see it. Now you really got to control it up to where we are today.
Yeah. You know, and Space Mountain was deferred for so long because at one time they wanted to have 4 tracks on it, and they were going inside and outside of the building, and it was too much, I guess, for any one single brain. They tried to, I don't know, I'm scooping myself, but they tried to hire Ed Catmull at the end of the 60s when he had just graduated from a university in Utah. I can't remember which one, but and Dave Snyder interviewed him and said, we need someone to develop a computer that can help us design, not only design this crazy roller coaster, but then also control it, do the ride control. And Ed wasn't interested in it because he wanted to get into computer graphics.
By the way, for you who don't know that name, Ed Catmull, I met him a long time ago. The secret sauce inside of early Pixar was all Ed Catmull. He was a very quiet guy, but somehow he could see things to how digital stuff will work. and explain it very carefully.
Yeah, I mean, he's one of the inventors of digital animation.
Yeah.
And he was valuable there up until his retirement. So they brought him in. He wasn't interested, and
Yeah.
it took a while before they had the capability to design and know that they could control this attraction called Space Mountain.
So, how do you see everything that you gathered up to date? You're getting it pretty well authenticated as archaeological evidence, let's say.
Right.
It's funny to use the name.
There are endnotes.
Yes, okay. What would be the next steps that gradually leads to a book being formatted and the pages figured out, and eventually how a book
It's
would
happening
be?
now.
It's happening now.
It's happening now.
What can you tell us
So
about
volume
that?
1 has been submitted. And I actually mocked it up using Keynote on a Mac. I mocked it up really just to make sure this is 160 pages and not 210 pages or 50 pages. It was understanding and knowing what the right amount of imagery versus text. So the mystery was how much text, do I do for each person who I've, learned about. But there's also all of these great photos. Plus, I created diagrams of where the work took place. So I've done diagrams of the WED office when it was in the Zorro building, when it was in the animation building, the machine shop layout, and then where these photos that you see all the time, where were those photos taken? So I even have little indices with arrows that show the direction, where the camera was for some of the photos. And so it's full of it's full of that. And so I felt that I needed to mock it up so I knew in my head how to proportion everything in the book. So that has been submitted, and the text has been submitted, and the text will be filtered through 4 or 5 individuals, including Disney Legal. It is in that process now of having the text reviewed, and I've handed over the mock-up, which will be relayed out and improved, hopefully, because I've never laid out a book before, so it's probably too busy in some, graphically too busy in some places. But I'm hoping it should be out within the year. We were trying to get it out by the end of last year, but COVID backed everything up,
What does it feel like that your baby is slowly sliding out of your hands and going out into the mechanics of book publishing?
I couldn't be happier. If people have good ideas about what could be cut or added, I'm all for it. So far, what I've seen of the graphic layout is an improvement upon what I've done. So I'm anxious to get started on the second volume. I've probably gathered most of the material for the subsequent volumes. But having focused too much on this book over the last 2 or 3 years, everything else in my life has backed up now. Things need to be repaired at home or I need new garage doors. And a similar thing going on with another home up north. So I'm all of a sudden kind of going crazy, and I've had to put it off to the side for a little bit, but I'll jump back into it hopefully in a couple of weeks. And we'll see how it goes. I'm anxious to get the first volume out because I think that will generate interest and awareness that might open up additional doors to other, because I've gotten my information, the Disney Archives has been very helpful, but I can't rely only on the Disney Archives because there's collections all across the country. And I've probably driven them crazy anyway at the Disney Archives, spending too much time there. But there are collections in universities and at places like the Library of Congress, things you've never seen before. So UCLA has some interesting things. USC has some interesting things. The University of Central Florida, some university in the middle of Illinois. It's not in Chicago, it's in the middle of Illinois. Has some things, New York Public Library has some. I haven't gone to all these places, but I've gone to some of them, and each one has had some, like photo collection especially, that's amazing. Like photos of Walt that you've never seen, photos of some of these unsung Imagineers, unknown Imagineers.
Well, you know the funniest thing, this I'm getting the impression that you had just barely started to dig into the archaeological facts, and it sounds like you're going to have nothing but discovery paths expanding for the next couple of volumes in this thing.
Well, it's going to go chronologically. So volume 2 will be the remaining years at the studio where they're learning about this new form of art. Like, oh my God, it's popular. People like this. We've got to add to it. What doesn't work about what we built, and what do we need to do going forward? And so that's a fascinating story, which all includes the 1959, Tomorrowland editions, but other things that they were considering at the time.
Okay.
And then the next volume is they moved to Glendale.
Okay.
And if there's a 4th volume, it will be focused on Walt Disney World.
This is going to be an incredible encyclopedia of history, focusing first on WID and then out into the other parks.
Yeah.
You would have to live to 100 years old to try to get everything collected and written down. Oh my gosh.
I think of this as kind of a seeding project where I'm going to get a certain amount of, newly discovered information, and then other sleuths can take that information because the dots have now been started on this connect the dots puzzle. And so I've got a lot of the dots established, and now hopefully younger historians and Imagineers will take over. I'm basically a 2nd gen Imagineer covering the 1st gen.
Yes. Okay.
I'm hoping that there'll be a 3rd gen to cover the 2nd gen, et cetera, and that it establishes a tradition.
Okay.
I hope.
Yeah, this is going to be... Well, Tom, I have learned so much from you this morning, and I've known you for a very long time, and I only basically know you from the constant questions and answering and verifying things. Now I have a much better understanding of why you've been asking me all this time, and have some idea of what's going to continue beyond this 1st generation. So thank you very much
welcome.
coming down to my show here. Okay, kids, you heard it first here. Not only a book all about early Imagineering, but from the guy who has personally collected all of this stuff and is putting all this stuff together, and it's being headed off into a printing press eventually.
And who was an Imagineer?
Yes, it was. Yeah, well, we'll have to. I completely ignored his history of doing so many projects with Disney, but that's going to be another program. That will be the 2nd chapter of Talking to Tom. Thank you very, very much, Tom, again.
You're very welcome.
Fantastic.
Enjoyed it.
Okay, kids, you heard it first here. See you next time.